having just a dialogue, a conversation, if you will, with renowned author, poet, prophetic preacher, extraordinaire that has a scholar, professor. I think there's about 8 P's that I probably missed about 5 of them. But I am so excited about having you here on Scarritt. Again, thank you so much, Dr. Cheryl Kirk-Duggan, for participating in the installation blessing service on Sunday. Your presence means such a joy to me to have you here and to welcome you to Scarritt and walk these hollow grounds all week and dine with you and have discussions, and wanted to most certainly have others to join in on the richness that we were able to just glean from you this whole week. And so want to have an opportunity of clergy, our first clergy conversation, if you will, inaugural clergy conversation. You're the first at the beginning of the year, 2022, for us to have a dialogue just for a moment this afternoon with clergy that are in and folks that are inside the historic Harambe Auditorium here on the campus of Scarritt, as well as those that are witnessing by way of live stream on YouTube and Facebook. We welcome you in the place. We want to give you an opportunity to go ahead, like, share, as well as invite other folks to come in and join on this conversation. At any point in time you would like to type in your comments or your questions, we have staff that are waiting and watching to most certainly pass those questions along to us to make sure that we answer your questions as well while you are indeed watching with us. So I'm going to really, Doc, just give you an opportunity for others to know who you are. If you would be so kind as to let folks know, since I probably only gave 3 of the 5 8 P's.
Oh, Reverend Sondrea Tolbert, it has been an extreme pleasure to be on Scarritt Bennett's campus this week. The installation services were incredible. If you were not privy to them, I strongly invite you to go on the YouTube and watch them. It was all women led, it was prophetic, it was anointed. I am Reverend Dr. Cheryl A. Kirk-Duggan. I'm so blessed, called by God to be an international ambassador, to be a pastor to pastors, musician, poet, scholar. In terms of learnings, I am to be an intellectual instigator. So whenever I do classes or presentations, my job is to help people push the envelope. If you say you believe something, why? Because of what? And what is the impact? And how do we live out what we say we believe? And how do we not take ourselves so seriously, understanding that there are 2 energies in the world, love and fear. I started off as a church girl, sang my first solo in church when 4, started taking piano when I was 5, started playing for church when I was 11. So when it was time to go to college, I didn't know what you did in a pew because I'd always either been on the piano and organ, did a couple of degrees in music, then did a stint in New York, accepted my second call to ministry. The first time God called me, I said, no, not interested. But if this is you, I'll have to do this again. Went on to seminary and then realized during that second year that I wasn't called to be in a local parish. I was called to be a pastor to pastors, so I got the PhD and have been teaching. I've been blessed to teach in all women's school and a predominantly white institution, which was a consortium of 9 seminaries and about 10 or 12 research centers. And I've taught at 2 different HBCUs, and I've just retired, kind of, sort of, since I'm still teaching with them. And these days I'm working on my own LLC, and that is to help people help themselves not experience pain so that they can process their grief, whether it's from a loss of a loved one, a divorce, a bad breakup, job loss, loss of self from caregiving, loss of limbs, loss of dreams. And I'm also working to help people do writing excellence, because I believe everyone can write. They may not be an Ernest Hemingway or Toni Morrison, but everyone has a voice, and I take much joy in doing that. And my metaphor for life is laughing, dancing, and singing with God, so I keep myself entertained.
And keep us all entertained as well. Because as I was looking at it, and I will let everyone know, my encounter with Dr. Kirk-Duggan would be that she was challenging and most certainly in her role as an intellectual instigator, because it is from that experience in seminary, at Payne Theological Seminary, in the womanist was it womanist
Womanist theology
theology
intensive.
intensive? It was an
Yeah.
intensive, a whole week. Books galore. The bibliography alone made you go, huh, I got to read all of this. But the text that you uplifted during that time frame for us was, many of us had been in church all of our lives, and some of the texts that you had us reviewing and dissecting and chewing on and then regurgitating and going back over to make sure we understood really from the contextual standpoint about those, really stimulated the conversation of where I really want us to go kind of a little tonight, with really coming together to kind of come together, let's reason together, to lift up the voices. Here at Scarritt, we have 4 tenets: spiritual formation, transformative education, women's empowerment, and racial justice. And so, if you will, several of your books hit all of those in some shape, form, or fashion. And from the perspective, if you will, I will tell you, when as a seminary student, first go round, first class, delving in, and you say read about a woman that has been cut up and body parts strode all over the city, that I went, is that really in the Bible? And why has not someone in Bible study, in preaching from the pulpit, uplifted this text? And so, if you will, Doc, if you will, just for a moment, help us deal with problematic texts and how we can deal with those from the pulpit, as well as in Sunday school, as well as is how do we have that type of dialogue with folks around some of the problematic texts that are in the Bible?
That's a great question. One of the first places that I want to enter the conversation, invite people to say, first of all, we do not worship the Bible. And for some seminary students, at first time, you mean I can highlight the Bible? I mean, these days, a lot of Christian bookstores will sell Bibles and highlighters for that. But when you were going through, it's like highlight the Bible, mark in the Bible. So we want to be very careful we don't worship the Bible. And we also understand, and some people might say this is sacrilegious, but those biblical texts were an oral tradition for hundreds of years. So I'm amazed that we have a Bible. And we also need to realize that there are a lot of texts that were not canonized in the year 90 in Jamnia, which is North Africa. There were a group of scholars that said we'll include these texts, and we won't include these texts because of the Greek or the Hebrew. And even with the King James Version, which some people think that Jesus spoke the King James Version, which Jesus did not, King James hired 47 scholars to do the translation and to include those. And they therefore, since he was paying them, they had his bias. And it's just like anytime you read a book, always look at the publisher, because publishers have their own niche, and that will determine how a writer writes and respond like that. And so when you understand that these are living texts that have some challenges because they're coming out in particular sociocultural reality, when you think and realize that, number one, women were not taught to read, and that's why you have this text that women should not speak in church. It has nothing to do with women not preaching or teaching or pastoring. That's miseducation. Back in the day, you'd have men on one side, women on the other side, and since worship was about singing or repeating the Psalms, and if you can't read and women would sit on this side, show me any place where you put a group of people on this section, they can't do anything, this section's participating, those folks are going to start talking. So then, of course, I'm going to say, well, women, you ought not speak. It's because they're interrupting the flow of the service. But again, that's why when people do Bible, I would strongly recommend have commentaries, have concordances, that where you can look at what was the Hebrew, what was the Greek. So for example, I have an ongoing conversation with one of my bishops about Proverbs 31. When Dr. Tina Pippin, who teaches at Agnes Scott College in Decatur, Georgia, and I did a Samea volume, we wanted to look at mothers and their children in the Bible. There are a lot of articles and books about fathers and their children, not mothers. And so I said, what do I want to do? So I always encourage people, when you're writing, write about something you're passionate about. either that you're so excited about or that it makes you angry, because then you'll be passionate about writing, because no one wants to read anything you're bored with writing. So I chose Proverbs 31. Well, when you look at the Hebrew, the first 11 verses are about the queen mother and her sons. So it's like, oh, so dad's not the king. That's interesting. More so, verses 11 through 31, it talks about what this woman does. It's a horrible text to be given to women for Mother's Day and for Women's Day, which a lot of black churches do, because she's a workaholic. We need much more balance. There's no intimacy. No one cares about her. No one loves on her. It's about what can she do for everybody else. And then the creme de la creme, at the very end, the last 5 or 6 verses, there are descriptors or adjectives that are describing this woman. And those who've studied the Romance languages like Italian, French, you know that they have articles so that adjectives, whether nouns are masculine, feminine, or neuter. Same thing happens in Hebrew, and so when I'm looking, I'm going, wait a minute. The articles that are describing this queen mother are articles that are usually used for a man or a god. So for me, this is not necessarily everyone's translation, Kirk-Duggan's translation. What this is telling me is that the Hebrew poet is being ironic. Who can find a virtuous woman? No one can, because she doesn't exist, because these descriptors are for a man or a god. The text got on my nerves. And I really think we need to read the scriptures and help people read them where they can come alive, but where there's also balance. Name the misogyny. And the text that you mentioned earlier, Judges 19. When I first read that, I went, wait a minute. First of all, the man says the men can't go out and be with the men, but you can take this woman. So he's okay with sacrificing his daughters, where we heard that one before. And then they take this woman, and the text makes it clear she's raped all night. The text does not make it clear when they bring her back, is she alive or dead? And then the text goes on to say, then she's dismembered into 12 pieces and then sent to the various tribes of Israel. So I had a friend say, do you think that really happened? I said, well, whether it actually happened or not, that you're going to have a sacred text that says you can cut up women into 12 parts and send her body parts. And we live in a world of misogyny. We live in a world where domestic violence and sexual assault is up, and with COVID, it's increased because a lot of people really think, well, you my property, so I can do with you what I want to do. And it wasn't until really the Anita Hill hearings and everything that a lot of even local police, if you had a domestic violence call, would actually do something. And then they had to start saying, even if the woman won't protest, we're still going to arrest this person anyway. Of course, women also engage in domestic violence. A lot of times there's more psychological. So we really need to help people learn how to be in community, learn how to be in relationships without being abusive.
And so with changing the narrative, I guess, how do we help both clergy as well as lay to understand the nuances regarding how women are portrayed in the Bible, in the text?
A slow process of education. And I would invite to do parallel stories, because some of the ancient scenarios are foreign to us. When I was teaching at Meredith College, an all-women's college, and teaching the Intro to the Bible, I had a conversation with the late Dr. Katie Cannon. I'm saying, I want to help these students have an entree into Scripture. And many of these young people, and many of today, they've never been inside of a church. They can't tell you where Genesis is and have no idea what Revelation is. And this particular book by Mary Helen Washington, Memory of Kin, is a series of short stories about relationships. So there's some between spouses, between parents and children. And so then I would take one of those short stories and have the class read that short story, while I would have them to read a biblical story. And then in addition to that, because people learn by stories, in addition to doing that, you can bring in case studies from contemporary times and say, how do we do this? One of the things, for example, Nathan doesn't tell David, you're bad and wrong. You messed up. You raped Bathsheba and you set up Uriah to die. Nathan told David a story which paralleled that, and David was incensed, said, that's terrible. And that's when Nathan said, that's you. So we cannot, or I would not advise people to tell people that they're wrong from the front. We have to invite people into stories because also faith is very fragile. And a lot of times if I go into a classroom and I challenge something that people grew up hearing, even if they've been church or not church, well, first of all, they're going to get defensive. It's like, wait a minute, you messing with my Bible. Or I love that pastor that's been with me for 20 years and now I come to seminary, you're going to tell me that person was wrong. So to be very gracious and say, well, people do the best they can with what they know. Let me share with you what my experiences have been, and then invite people into the conversation, invite them to ask questions. That's one of the best ways to listen and find out what people's relationships are. And one last thing is really to help seminarians also understand we have people's lives in our hands. So going to seminary, that's a professional school. We should hold it in the same regard we do medical school or law school. We don't expect for somebody who we're going to hire to be an attorney to have watched Matlock or CSI or something and be okay. No, we want that person to have gone to law school, passed the bar, and have had several cases, not be the first. If we have to have a medical procedure, we don't want somebody, we don't even want an intern. We want someone, preferably at a teaching hospital, who's done their internship, who's done extra studies, and who's done this surgery about 10,000 times. Then maybe we'll be comfortable. So just like we hold doctors and attorneys at that level of expectation of education, we need to hold seminarians and ministers and pastors too. And if they're not blessed to go to seminary, then they need to do some continuing education.
You mentioned that we learn by stories. It brings to mind a conversation I had with one of our mothers. She said, when did preachers change from telling stories when they preach to having 3 points in a close?
Well, to that one, there's always been various schools of thought on preaching, because when I was trained, I'm always going to give you that thesis and 3 points and close. Now, that doesn't mean I won't engage stories in the midst of it. There's a school of thought where some ministers will do one idea and tell a story. So it depends upon how the person was trained, and also traditions. So for example, in the Roman Catholic tradition, priests will always preach from the gospel. There'll be a reading on the Psalms and another Old Testament reading, and probably maybe even a reading from the epistle, but the priest will always preach from one of the 4 gospels. In other traditions, I think sometimes people preach way too much Paul and don't do enough about Jesus. So it depends upon how the person was trained, where they grew up.
Yes, she was I will say mother is probably about 97. And she says, I learned by stories. Jesus taught by stories. And if Jesus taught by stories, certainly someone else needs to preach by stories. Another one of your books that really kind of resonates with me, may not be one that some are familiar with, but it is a book regarding the hip-hop culture. Wake Up. Let me make sure I got the title correct, and I will.
That's correct. Wake Up, Hip Hop and the Black Church.
Yes, okay, it was. Okay, it was. Okay, it was.
How that came, here's another story, how that came about, and talk about divine synchronicity. One semester, it was a fall semester, one of my students, Leon Parker, he's married now with 2 children and all that, and Leon hadn't yet married, and Leon said, Doc, I said, what, Leon? He said, look, you got to help us out. We have a generation that knows hip-hop, but we need to know something about hip-hop. So in the curriculum that we had at that time, I said, I tell you what, if you get 6 to 8 people who are interested, I'll do a readings course, and we'll focus on hip-hop. The same time that occurred, literally almost the same week, I got a call from Abington Press, who's based here in Nashville, and they said, would you be the senior scholar and partner with a junior scholar who's an anthropologist, Marlon Hall, and work on this book on hip-hop? So I said, sure. So I had to make it up, and came up with a working outline, and then found the books to do that, and taught the class. And then after that, I presented the outline to Marlon. I said, tell you what, you select the chapters you'll write, and I'll do the others. And what's fascinating is Marlon and I have never been in the same space together.
Oh, wow.
we did everything through email and text. And there were a couple times I say, Marlon, we need to talk because that's when texts were first coming up. I said, this texting business will not allow for the space of what we need to do. And so some parts of the book, it's I'm speaking, other times he's speaking. And sometimes when I look at it, it's hard to tell who spoke, so we're specific about that. And that's how we got into it. So then again, necessity is the mother of invention. That's when I start to listen to, I think I did a piece on Tupac and Lauryn Hill. And I had to listen to the music, and it had straightened my head and curled it again when I was listening to some of the language, and that's when I learned about the brilliance of Tupac, but also the brokenness. You know, so it's very, very interesting. Again, learning people's story helps. So for the seminarians who are listening, anytime you're reading a book, always pay attention who the publisher is and learn some backstory on the author. And read the preface closely because you want to figure out why the person wrote the book and what it is that they expect you to learn from it. And then you can engage in conversation with them as if they've completed their task.
Tupac is certainly a street prophet of much of really honing in on the voice of the community and the voice of the times and what was going on. Another for me that I always kind of quote, the prophet of Prince, the prophet. How do you get through this thing called life?
Exactly, and I think a wonderful way, if I were going to create I wanted to do an intergenerational Bible study or Christian education or spiritual formation, I would do it all through music. I would get some hip hop, I would get some blues, because I mean, and folks think hip hop can be a little bit raunchy and they have a trouble. They need to listen to some of the body blues or some of those blues women. I mean, that will straighten, curl your hair and straighten it again, because they're like you said, the street prophets. They're talking about, hey, this is what I'm doing every day. This is the hellaciousness of my life. And it would also be fascinating. I just thought about this. What would it be like, in the words of Dr. Dwight Hopkins, who teaches at University of Chicago Divinity School, he calls them little shorties. That's our young men and women on the streets of Chicago. What if we could create an environment where we could have their stories? Because those babies, everybody wants love. A lot of times they're growing up in situations where there may be one parent, grandparent may be raising them. They want love. But if we were on a conversation and the young man talked about a 5-year-old who was standing there and saw his dad murdered in front of him. Then his grandmother, who was like a really godmother to him, nurtured him, died very slowly of cancer. So this child is traumatized before 8 by the death of his dad and the death of his grandmother. And then his mother treated him like dirt, said, you'll never amount to anything. So of course they're going to be explosive and have a lot of issues. But we often don't teach people how to parent. We don't even know how to talk to each other. So if I could revolutionize education, starting with pre-K on up, by the time they get in the 3rd grade, conflict resolution. How can we disagree without being disagreeable? How can we love on each other? How do you parent? Some people will read and get training, but others will parent the way they were parented. So if their parents beat up on them, they'll beat up on their kids. And then you have intergenerational trauma at home. And so when you get to school, you expect them to sit in class and not be disruptive. Well, but they can be.
Because that's all they know.
That's all they know. That's exactly right.
That's all they know. You mentioned about loss, grief. Another one of your works, if I may, is Baptize Rage, Transform Grief, How I Got Through, and So Can You. We have this idea about grief and loss being something that is merely to be gotten over. That deal with it, move on. And we process grief with grieve on the move. You know, we often hear grieve on the move. We often do not give grief its proper place in our lives. We often don't view grief as a part of the journey of our life's journey, of a part of the transition of our lives, and see crying as a weakness. and that it is indeed grief is a weak moment. But here, even in the text, we find that Jesus that wept. We find that often God would say, "Listen, Moses, my servant, is dead. Go on, move on." How do you suggest that we are to deal with grief in order to really get to the next level or get through what you've gone through, to walk through the valley and not get stuck in the valley? When you've gone through a series of transitions, what would be your advice of dealing with this notion of grief and theology?
That is a great question, and you've really layered it well. I would say the beginning part is there are many things in life that most of us will never experience. Mm-hmm. Like a lot of people will never fly an airplane, will never be an astronaut, others will never run a marathon, others will never be in a cook-off at one of the French culinary contests. All of us, regardless of our age, race, ability, sexual orientation, class, all of that, everybody at some point will experience grief. Mm-hmm. And when I look at our culture, when I look at our world, we experience, and grief is a result of a loss. So we lose loved ones, and sometimes that's an easy transition, other times it's not. And even if whether the parent or the person we lost is beloved, or whether that person was a perpetrator, whether that was our molester, that loss still has to be grieved. So loss of a loved one, job loss, divorce or bad breakup, loss of self from caregiving, because sometimes parents give so much taking care of children, sometimes they're taking care of children on the one end and aging parents or relatives on the other end. And that's not even counting if a child has challenges, whether it's autism or some sort of physical or other mental challenges. All of those are losses because that's the loss of a dream. Well, I thought my child would graduate and become. And then you have a loss of other dreams. Well, I wanted to get married. That didn't happen. Or I always thought I'd own my own business. That didn't happen. The loss of limbs or functioning body parts. So everyone, it's sort of like it clears the base. Everyone has lost. So the first thing is to be aware of it. Grief is real. Grief must be processed on what I call the 4 levels of the body. Because many times people think about grief, well, I'll deal with it spiritually. No, but it's the soul or spirit, physically, the body, mentally, our thought process, and emotionally. I'll give a quick personal caveat. The year after my dad died, I was in seminary getting ready to do Greek, and I'm thinking, what's the matter with me? Because I was sitting down and I'd be watching television, everything is cool, and I start crying. Well, I wasn't responding to what I was watching on television or what I was reading. I'm going, what are these tears about? So it was later, after a series of other experiences, I went, oh, it's been a year since Dad died. So my body, my physical self let me know that, excuse me, there's some issues that you've not resolved, you have to process it. So the first piece is awareness, and to not have shame or guilt over that, to know there's a process. One of the worst things we can do in the world is tell our 3 or 4-year-old little boys, don't you cry, you're a man. No, he's not a man. He's a little boy. And if we tell him stop crying, in that instance, we've told him, number 1, we don't care about your pain. 2, you don't need to acknowledge it and suck it up. How many men have been scarred from childhood, and then we want them to be compassionate, empathetic when they get grown? Well, but you told them at 3, we didn't care about your feelings. You don't have a right to have them, and you sure better not cry. So there needs to be ways that parents help give boys permission to cry, even if they say cry away from others so you won't get teased and won't be bullied. We've got to name the grief and then figure out a way to process it. So when I was processing the loss of my husband a decade ago, I sought out a grief counselor, and anyone can go to most hospice agencies. They have grief counselors, and you can go to them even if your loved one did not use their services. So that was the mental piece, the thinking part. and to know that everything begins with a thought. That's the first level of creation. And then I dealt with the mental and emotional part by getting the counseling. I did a lot of journaling. I wrote a lot of poems. I also doodled a lot. So I bought me some pencil colors and some felt tips and did that. And I also did a lot of hot yoga. So that to get the physical has to be in that. And the spiritual, I prayed a lot. So all those 4 areas. So I asked my grief counselor, Mitzi, I said, you got to give me a toolkit. This is hard. She said, I can't give you a toolkit. So every loss is different. So I lost Dad 6 months after Mike and I got married. Mother died in the midst of my doctoral program. Each loss was different because each relationship was different. And also I had a various level of maturity at those different times. So we have to figure out each time, how do we do this? And dance, do some kind of physical movement because we're really too much of couch potatoes. Then do something spiritual, get a therapist. Every minister, priest, pastor, rabbi, imam needs to have a spiritual director or a therapist.
Yes.
Have someone you can talk to and work it out.
And I want to make sure that I give an opportunity for those that are present to ask questions, as well as those that are on live to ask questions, either in the chat. And I noticed that one of your fellow seminarians is here, Reverend Dr. Elmitra Terry is here, that was in that Payne Theological Seminary Womanist theology class, that intensive, that we were baptized by fire into womanist theology. So Dr. Terry is here and wanted to make sure that you saw her. Where was I? We were, when we're talking about grief, and the process of grief and writing through it or doodling through it, you also have a writing book now that's out. And let me make sure I get the right quote on that one as well. Breaking Free to Write, From Fear to Finish.
Thank you. That's my most recent publication. I had such fun doing that one. I love to write, and I didn't set out as a kid to be a writer, and I love to help people write. And this book takes you from an idea through a finished product. Because the first thing is to know that you can write. You have something to say, and someone needs to read it. Even if it's your grandmother, your godmother, who, if you said Jesus wept, they say, oh, great, baby, that's wonderful. It comes organically. A lot of us have been taught to go do the research, then write. And the process that I've developed over the last 30 years by observing people, by watching my own methodology comes from internally. So you start off, what's the idea? What's the paper for? And again, for people, if you're in school, whether it's at the doctoral level or you're in junior high, if you have a paper to do, make it work for you. Mm-hmm. Just don't pick something out the air. Do it on something you're passionate about. And then figure out what's your metaphor for writing. What is it, something that you do well and you excel at it, you don't need anyone to tell you. Because then writing is about you celebrating your own gifts. My metaphor for life is laughing and dancing and singing with God. So when I'm writing, that's what I'm doing. I had one student I worked on and first developed this concept. For him, at first he said it was making bread. Then he said, no, it's making soup. So then I showed him each part of making soup. One was getting the thesis statement, the lens, and then the abstract and the various components of the methodology, which becomes your working outline and his completion. And so in the book, I talk about, you do the free association to figure out what are the things, what are the ideas that come. Put those things together, you create a question. Whatever the burning question is, something you're curious about, something you would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning and be happy to do, then that becomes your working thesis statement. Now in humanities, a thesis statement, we don't give a conclusion. It's something you will examine, you explore, you investigate, you analyze. In the sciences and math, a thesis statement is a theorem. E equals mc squared. So we have to always be writing for whatever the discipline we're writing for. And then after you create the abstract, your abstract will tell you what are the key themes. Then you go to your database or whatever resource you're using for your library holdings and figure out, okay, if this is what I'm writing about, what books, what articles do I need? And if you're doing like a 12-page paper, you don't need 25 articles. 12 should be enough. That so many books, so many articles. And then in the book, I talk about how you go from, as you read, you write. So there's a table that you set up. And left to right, you have the concept, then the citation, so the full bibliographic citation, page numbers, and then whatever you're talking about. So if I'm talking about the founding of Scarritt Bennett, then that would be in the first column. The next column would be whatever historical book I found. Then the pages, let's say I'm going to read chapter 3. Then that next page, I'm reading about Scarritt Bennett was founded by so-and-so and so. Then you're typing. No underlining, no post-it notes. So this method is efficient and it's organic. So it saves a lot of time because some people, they'll read, then they'll underline, they go back. No. Read and write while you're reading.
Wow, because I am a post-it note. I am a I'm a highlighter. I have about 5 different highlighter pens and highlight this. Then, oh, this is a thought I have, and let me go write. That was so free. That method is very freeing because that. But I always feel that there was a need to go back and reference and have that in that area.
Well, so you'll have your reference because you always have your citation.
That's what very easy.
Exactly.
That's what as opposed to going and looking for it in various different places.
That's right.
Then you already have it there.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
And then just go and put that.
Brilliant.
And then let's say you have an idea. Say, wait a minute. I'm not sure I agree with this understanding of why Scarritt was founded. And so then you hit your tab button for the next row and you put the same concept, and then for the bibliographic citation, put me. Mm-hmm. And then there's no page number question. Go, well, I want you to think more about this concept because it doesn't make sense to me, or it seems that the author has contradicting what they said here about the founding of Scarritt and the meaning for the United Methodist Women, for example. So you're always engaged. It's a conversation. Mm-hmm. So what happens is the process of writing is the writer yourself engaging other authorities in conversation, with your voice being as important as the authorities. Because if I wanted to know what the authorities will have to say, I can go read them. That's why some students make a mistake when they write. They'll put 50 different direct quotations on a page. No, if I want to read them, I'll go read them. I want to know, how do you engage that work and what is your take on it, because your experiences bring a unique lens to that particular event.
I've got to get to writing.
Oh, absolutely.
I've got to get to writing. When we're discussing text and when we're looking at connecting with the text and how you're writing the text, another one of your books, you like I said, you have over 25, but another one that helps with spiritual formation is entitled The Undivided Soul, Helping Congregations Connect Body and Spirit.
Too often, to use one of your analogies earlier, we place ourselves in silos and we bifurcate. So my intellectual life is here, my church life is here, my play life is here, my sensual sexual life is here, and then everything else is over here. No, but I'm the constant. And so it's really about how to become an integrated self. No body shaming, no denying. And so especially when I'm working with seminarians, I said, for example, watch your body posture and really look at how people identify and at how we set people up at culture. Because when we were meeting in church, typically male way to sit, he'll sit with his legs wide open. Now, if a woman sits like that, they're going to want to give you they call it that cloth. I tell them, don't give me no cloth. I learned how to sit before people back in the day when we were wearing miniskirts, so I know how to sit like this. And so, but just that alone, that we teach women to sit like this, but men can sit like this, and that's supposed to be okay. Well, why is that okay? Why can't he plant his feet with knees closed? So, but just that in itself, we have such, let's see if I can get all the language right, white supremacist, patriarchal, capitalistic, misogynistic world. And that influences every aspect of our lives, whether Dr. So-and-so, female, 20 years of experience, 10 books out, and Dr. So-and-so, male, same amount of credentials, almost invariably, he'll get more respect than she will. He'll get paid more for the same amount of experience. And so one of the things that's important for us to do is start to deconstruct some of that and call it out. And then in many of our congregations of color, then we practice the same thing. I said it years ago, and I'll say it again. If the women, the Roman Catholic, the Southern Baptists, and the Missionary Baptists, and the Pentecostal churches say it, we're not tithing, we're not showing up online during COVID. Revelation, women should be able to preach. Women should be able, could pastor. I mean, that's such, I'm sorry, don't mean to be disrespectful. That is such foolishness. Most of the time, who teaches people that basic theology? Now lay me down to sleep. Those first prayers, those first theological components wherein this is how we live our lives and build our ethics. It's a woman.
It's a woman.
Had it not been for Mary Magdalene, we might not be sitting here today. Because in all of the Gospels, all four, Mary Magdalene is there. She was the one who stayed there because the boys' book, they were scared, as they say in North Carolina. They were terrified, so they ran. Jesus in one instance, and another instance, a young man, and another instance, some angels come to Mary Magdalene and says, euangelion in the Greek, go preach. And so, but people get hung up on what people's genitalia. That's foolishness.
Pure foolishness.
Yeah.
Foolishness again. When we speak about women, and there's and women and violence, and I think we talked about the Judges 19 text. There's a couple of other books that you have that wanted to uplift. Exercising Evil, a Womanist Perspective on the Spirituals.
That was a fun, well, all of them have been fun reasons for different reasons. One of the memorable experiences when I got to interview Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan for that. And this was when I was in, originally was my dissertation, when it's far removed now in this rendering, because I had a wonderful editor who said, write the book you wanted to write. So that gave me permission. When I was doing my doctoral work, we had to do outside areas, and so I decided to do philosophy and music. I went to the music department. If she would have said do bacchorals, do operas, whatever, I would have done it. My question was, I would like to do research on music that relates to justice. So she said, why don't you do the spirituals? So I said, well, let me look at the 1960s civil rights movement about because a lot of the mass meetings were in churches, and people like Bernice Johnson Reagan and the various groups and quartets that sang would use the spirituals. So there were 4 different types of music. 1, they took hymns because they were meeting in churches. 2, they took the spirituals and changed the words. So over my head, I hear music in the air, becomes over my head, I hear freedom in the air. Then there were popular songs that they redacted also. So the song, the Banana Boat song by Harry Belafonte, Deo, Deo, daylight coming, I want to go home, becomes freedom, freedom, freedom comes and I want to go home. And then there was another sort of popular group of music that they wrote for the movement. I remember one was called My Dog, Your Dog. My dog visits with your dog visits with my dog. Why can't we as human beings get along the way the dogs get along? And so in that work, I talk about the spirituals as exercising evil. By that, they name the evil of the violence and they expose it, and then come up with ways to live through it. So when you exercise, you open up and name something, and then you call it out to help remove it so that healing can happen.
How do you love music, and you are an accomplished musician. How do we use the music, the vibration, the sound of the times now, in this afterwards of Me Too movement, in the afterwards of Black Lives Matter, from this calling forth now, what then becomes the sound of the music that we are to embody now as new freedom songs?
That is a great, great question. One of the first things I thought about is a moan. I remember growing up, it's like, why are those old people sitting on their front porches? I grew up in Louisiana, and moaning. I said, and sometimes if you talk with them, I say, well, child, just live long enough. And so what I realized is sometimes words fail. That someone could put a knee on the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 48 seconds and think that that's okay. That Ahmaud Arbery can be running, minding his own business, and so we're going to hunt you down like you're some rabid dog. But again, that's fear. There's the fear of we've got to control these black bodies. And in the work of a psychologist, Resmaa Menakem, who practices in Minnesota, in his book, Grandmother's Hands, he talks about, again, here's where perception and imagery is so important. The perception is that white bodies exude innocence, black bodies are violent and impervious to pain. So I can put my knee on his neck for that time. That's why doctors oftentimes in hospitals where women are saying, something is wrong, I just gave birth and all the numbers look good, that's why we have such a huge amount of maternal mortality, because people think that black folks don't feel pain. And so I think to deal with the music, I think we really ought to sit and listen and see what comes of that. And we can go back historically. We've got the blues speak to some of that. I mean, when you think of Billie Holiday's singing of Strange Fruit, it is so haunting. Anita Simone's Mississippi Goddam. I mean, the music is there. Some of the riffs of some of our jazz greats. I think we already have lots of music. Some of the hymns. I mean, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a child. I'm not a wretch. That was Newman's testimony. Mm-hmm. And we have to be so careful with words. I refuse to sing wretch. That was his witness. So I think it becomes really important for us to work on the importance of words. Say what we mean and mean what we say. That's why I'm so staunch for inclusive language. And larger society have done that much better than the church. Larger society, we have firefighters, police officers, mail carriers. Some of us still want to use man. No, man is not inclusive, because in the preamble it says all men are created equal, stood for all white male Protestant landowners. That's why it was such a big deal when Kennedy was elected as the first Catholic president. So I think we need to be really aware of the impact and power of words, recognizing that we each give meaning to words that they have, and then to play with music. How great would it be for any group, whether it's a social group or a church group, to say we're going to listen to all kinds of music and then let people hear drumming, because drums will take you to a whole nother level, because as you beat of a drum, then the heartbeat allies with that. That's why we need to be very careful with the music that we play for people, because we can trigger something that we need to be responsible for. So I would love, like, at some point to do a class of an ethics and theology of music making as it touches people's hearts, so that we can be responsible with that. So I would play all kinds of music, classical music, and see what would work for the people, what moves them, and then invite people to write their own music.
That sounds like to be coming at Scarritt Bennett.
Absolutely.
That's what that sounds like.
You can get Brother Mike involved in that.
I think Brother Mike, yes, when we're speaking his language. There is indeed probably, we have a couple of more minutes, and I want to make sure that I have you answer some of the questions that have been proposed. We received a question on line for you to espouse upon a little bit more regarding transitions to grief and the transitions of grief. And those that are in the audience, while she's answering that, if you want to come to one of the mics and ask your question, you are available to do that as well.
Great. Well, grief is real. And again, I think the first thing is to be aware of it and not to be ashamed of it. And as best as possible, allow space for it. Get the emotional and professional help. Sometimes certain populations think, well, I can pray and get over it. Well, prayer by itself won't always help me handle my grief, because it basically, again, what is the impetus for the grief? Was it a death that was anticipated? Was it a death that just happened out of the blue? All of those dynamics around the issue of the loss, whatever it is, whether it's a downsizing of a job or death or divorce, whatever that loss is, and to understand that loss is a part of life. Then to say what is triggering the loss, because sometimes when people don't deal with early losses, when loss number 15 comes up and it blows them out of the water, almost paralyzes them, it's not about loss number 15, it's about all those other 14 losses that I never dealt with, and my body and my spirit say, okay, I'm done, and now I can't get out of bed. So it's about that, getting the professional help and allowing it the time, and find creative ways to use it. So maybe, clean out a closet, plant a garden, go and volunteer. There are various things. Take up a salsa class or a Texas slide class. Take an art class, because they're God has given us such a magnificent creation in these bodies and the creative gifts. So I would invite people to find healthy ways. We don't want destructive ways like getting drunk or doing drugs or compulsively eating, spending or sleeping around with folks we have no business sleeping around with. Find healthy ways and get with, again, professional support. And there are also support groups where you with people having specific losses, like losses of a child. No parent expects to lose a child. There are support groups where you shared losses, where you can learn ways of coping. And understand it'll be a process. And it's not going to happen overnight just because all the casseroles are gone, the flowers are dead. And when people say two things, and then I'll shut up. Don't tell people just move on and get over it, because that's disrespectful and that's like a curse. And please do not say, well, God needed another flower garden. That's a lot of bologna and cheese. We don't know what God needs. And that is not helpful. If we don't know what to say, when a lot of times we don't know what to say, the best thing is going, I'm praying for you. I'm holding you in prayer. What can I do? If you know they have children or have others, if you know there's an issue, if they need funds to help something, do a GoFundMe page. If you know they need, maybe they're taking care of aging parents, go and volunteer and help them. Help persons who have had a tremendous loss in concrete ways that they need. Ask them, what can I do? And sometimes all people need us to do is sit and be present. They don't need our wonderful advice. So if I could implore people, anything, don't offer advice unless you're asked, and ask the person, well, how can I help? Because most times people know what they need. Sometimes they need permission to say what they need.
And the ministry of presence is most certainly a gift that most are neglecting. And I guess I'll end with my last question. And if anyone else has another question, please let us know. One of the those that are speaking here says that grief will not be, Dr. Phyllis Sublett says, the grief will not be ignored. You cannot do it. You can do it now or later, but at some point you will grieve.
That's right.
As or someone else says, or God needed them more than you. That they hate that phrase, that God needed them more than you. So to stay away from those. So engaging with those that are actually, you have a cadre of audience that is actually listening and asking questions here as well. Another book that probably is of importance to lift up would be Misbegotten Anguish. Misbegotten Anguish, a theology of ethics and violence, war, suicide, and scapegoating. Having come from a place of much grief of 2021, one of them including a family member who had death by suicide, standing and walking through that, the anguish of even that young lady having just tattooed on her arm that she was unbreakable, and to be succumbed in this manner, full of life. And when individuals are seeing violence day in and day out, violence at the hands of others, violence that is being portrayed on television, and feeling the hopelessness, how can we, both laity and clergy, offer semblance of being able to give and offer hope to the hopeless?
It's a powerful question and so critical at this time. My go-to is express love. And my friend M.Div calls love facts, freedom, appreciation. He says communication. I add to that compassionate communication, trust and sincerity. It's important that we listen to people because sometimes, not all the times, but sometimes people will give us signals that something is wrong. And for us to say, well, they'll get over it, no, they won't get over it. So if you see a person acting differently, if they've always been outgoing and all of a sudden are quiet, or that there's a marked change in personality, it's important to say, I'm here for you. There are options. Can I walk with you? Can I sit with you? Can we get you some support or additional help? Because a lot of us don't realize the import of mental health. And it's very complicated. And in our larger culture, mental health is being painted as, oh, you crazy. So that's colored with shame and guilt, and I ought to be able to will to myself to be okay. Well, some of that is biological. People are born with that. Some of it is situational. And so we need to have a healthy respect for mental health. All our religious leaders and our teachers need training in mental health so that you can identify and then get people some support and some help. And also know that when people commit suicide, they were in such pain that they saw no other option. I once had a friend, fortunately, they were in a locked ward. They were in a facility, and they did journaling, and this person said, I'm just no good. The nurses saw that, got them into a locked ward and on some medication, and then processed that. So we really need to pay attention to everyone and to know that life is rugged right now. And if, you're under my sound of voice, if you are hurting, get help. There's no shame. We all need help sooner or later. Please get the help and not self-destruct.
And that's, and we have a question from the audience, Reverend Dr. Judy Cummins.
Yes, good evening, and thank you all so much for this conversation. I'm just intrigued by it. You mentioned Dr. Dwight Hopkins talking about the little shorties and so much of the intergenerational trauma that they have experienced. And I'd said for years that we need to stop asking people, asking kids, what's wrong with you, and start asking what happened to you.
Yes.
Coming through this COVID pandemic, not only do we need to ask children what happened to you, but I think that we need to start asking even adults what happened to you. And so much of what we're coming out of as we come through COVID, not only are churches having to pivot how they worship, but I think that pastors, preachers are going to have to pivot how they preach and how they message the message of the gospel. I'm newly retired, and so I just leave that to you all who are continuing to do that work, My interest, my question for you tonight, and I'm really intrigued by the newest book that you have about writing. So my dissertation is old now, 2008, The Stained Glass Ceiling in Black Baptist Churches, the Continuing Paradox of Liberation Theology. Now that I am retired, I do want to revisit that work and perhaps update it and write. You know, everyone who's ever wrote a dissertation wants to turn it into a book, right? But you hit the ground running and you find yourself working, and then you find years have passed and you've not done that work. How do you go back to do that work? Because that continues to be a passion, and I think that it continues to be relevant. Not just, I was at the time in the Baptist church, and so that was my context. How would I go about expanding that kind of work to make it relevant even today, using this method that you have now, and I wish I'd had a method like this because I did the exact opposite, using this updated method that you now have, how we can write. And as you answer that question, to just even think about particularly Black women, we do have so many stories in us, right? We have not only our stories, but we have our grandmother's stories, we have our mother's stories, we have auntie stories that we need to write. So how do we do that work, even looking back now, however many years it has been?
Thank you for the question, and congratulations on completing the dissertation and that work, and congratulations on retirement. My friend, the Reverend Gloria Roach Thomas, calls retirement refirement, so that in season 3 or in your act 3, you'll become a writer again. And a couple things. One, because of your passion, I would, while you are refired, I would suggest see if there are places with your wisdom where you might do some volunteer work or form a small group. One, to share and help coach pastors in that work and say, listen, and just a group of 6 or 8 people. And also, or another group or the same group to be a writing group. Then when you take your dissertation, since you'll have the files, what I recommend is printing it out. And I would, it'd be great if you had a writing buddy. You could do it a couple ways, either print it out or have a Zoom screen where you share, and do you all read paragraph by paragraph together, and then you could be typing using track changes, say, oh, I need to update this. So go through each chapter and figure out, what do I need to update? How do I need to tweak it? And also decide if, do I want to add other denominational women? Do I need to add case studies? And let it be fun. You've got the time, and then think about who you want to pitch it to for publication. There's a, I'm forgetting I think his name is Brian Allen. He does 2 different sets of emails. One I think is called Publishing in Color. And he does writing workshops, and I attended one in Chicago a couple of years ago. And what I liked about the writing workshop is there were persons of color who were editors and also who are writers. I think someone who was there from Upper Room was also there. So I would invite you to just explore, let this be an adventure, and see who else is doing what you're doing. Also, definitely do a literature search and see who else has written in this vein about women leadership, women in the church. So you can update your bibliography and cite those resources and have what I call a community of accountability. I suggest that for everyone, regardless of what your project is. So for example, someone say, girl, are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating right, moving? Or have you written today? Let's set a pack. You're going to work on a chapter and we'll check back in 2 weeks. So that it's not about, oh, I got to sit here and write. Oh, how is this going? But make it fun. Make it work for you. That's what I would suggest. And see where he goes, and again, and research to see which publishers would you want. I mean, for example, I know Judson Press does Baptist things, and you might want to look at Abington, depending upon which way you want to go, because again, each publisher has its own niche. And then also decide who's your audience. You want this a seminary audience? You want a church people audience? Does it need to be an academic book or a trade book? And how might you expand it? What are some things that need to come out? And the good news is because there's been enough time in between it, if there are things that are not relevant, it's going to be easier now to delete it, because when we first produced those dissertations, it's like, oh, you want me to take it the paragraph? Oh, but that's my baby. You know, it's like, oh, but you don't know how long I spent trying to. How important is it? And look at your thesis. Start off looking at your thesis statement. Is this what I want to talk about now? Is this what I've heard? And maybe also before you do some of that, I would have a conversation, maybe a Zoom conversation with several women who you respect and appreciate. Say, look, I want to rewrite my dissertation. I want to make it available for publication. You're a woman leader. You can say, hey, Reverend Sondrea, what do you think I should cover? You know, maybe send them a table of contents and a few, an abstract, and say, can we have a conversation? And then you can take that and see what resonates with your spirit. Because what does your soul need to speak? How is your mind thinking about this? What is your metaphor for writing? What is your metaphor for life? What do you wish you knew? What do you know now that you have told your 20 or your 30 or your 40-year-old self, first starting with that PhD program or first started in ministry? And think about all those and then play with it. It's just like if you think about a tapestry, whether it's a symphonic orchestra, whether it's Duke Ellington Sacred Concert, or whether it's some Stevie Wonder, or whether it's Muddy Waters. Who is the music? And if it would be a quilt, what would your quilt look like? So I would invite you to make this an adventure of exploration and see what comes up. What colors come up? What textures? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? And go for it.
And before I ask you what's next for you to close us out, there was one question for you to revisit. Facts, F-A-C-T-S.
Yes, my friend Najib, N-A-J-B, lives in New York, and I think he writes under the nomenclature of Love 101. So he has several books he's published, and when he talks about love, because he talk about there's two energies, love and fear is actually a call for love. And so when we see other people, and instead of taking it personally, understand they're hurting. If they weren't hurting, if they weren't coming from ego, then I wouldn't need to be on Reverend Sondrea. I wouldn't be talking about, child, she thinks she all of that in a bag of chips. She didn't invite me to speak at Scarritt, Bennett. If I got to go there, that's ego talking. So if she's my friend, then I can appreciate she's been elevated. That means I got a bit of the elevation too. So but ego is never okay, and and so my prayer for folks is always be rooted in the Holy Spirit, which is inside of all of us. We're all innocent. The Holy Spirit is inside of us. God created us in love, in the image of God. And so I think we beat people to death talking about they're sinners saved from grace. I'm going, no, you're created in the image of God and out of love. And what is love? Facts. F is freedom. Think about it. When you're free, that means I can be who God created me to be without apology. And I don't have to be like everybody else because I'm not. A, appreciation. What would happen if we tell our children, thank you, I'm so blessed to be your mother? My mother told me that once, and that's one of the reasons why I can be as radical and revolutionary as I am, because I grew up with people who they were grateful that I was their child. When was the last time someone sent thank you notes? Little acts of kindness. When you go to the grocery store, thank you so much for being here as a cashier. I appreciate that. Some people never get told thank you. Or the server, we don't be giving tips. Give the person a tip because they need the tips. That's appreciation. C, compassionate communication. Many of us don't talk, and we talk, but we don't listen. We're so with our agenda. Before a person finishes talking, we already have an answer. Well, if I have an answer to something Rev said, I wasn't listening. So how can we do active listening? And sometimes we don't have to always have an answer. We can say, you know what? That is a great question. Let me get back to you about that. So compassionate communication, saying thank you, being gracious, not talking over people. Because I've got a couple of friends like that. I've learned this. Let them talk. Because I go to say something before I can finish. I say, well, what y'all blah, 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 blah. No. Stop and wait. So compassionate communication, trust. Can I trust you? It's not complicated. It's not rocket scientist. And again, if I'm coming from love, then the Holy Spirit will let me know, and I can avoid toxic relationships. And Naeem has one book called Toxic Relationships, and we were having a conversation one day, and he remarked, I went like, wow, because I was saying that all states have a coalition against domestic violence and a coalition against sexual assault, and they'll say either 1 in 3 or 1 in 4. And he said, well, I think if you looked at it, 1 in 1. I said, what do you mean? He said, because all of us have engaged in self-abuse. Ate too much fried chicken, or went to the doctor and said, I need something for my acid reflux. Well, if you didn't eat that grease in the first place, you wouldn't need the pills. Our bodies let us know, and you can actually test this out. You go in the grocery store, you put something in your hand, do I need to buy it? Your body will tell you yeah or nay. We fail to listen. That's why you should also chew a lot. One of my practitioners taught me, she said, the enzymes for digestion in our bodies in our mouth. There's nothing in the esophagus. So that means if I'm snorkeling food down, which a lot of us learned from being in college because you only had so much of time to eat, but by the time the food gets to my stomach, it's basically garbage because it's not digested, and so it's going to pass out. My body's not receiving the nutrients, so we need to chew until it's nothing but almost no flavor. So if I'm not chewing well, if I'm not getting enough sleep, if I'm not staying hydrated, if I'm around toxic people, these are people who, no matter what I do, it's never good enough. I don't be around them people. I can love them, but from a distance. So let's see. So freedom, appreciation, compassion, communication, trust, sincerity. And to that I tie Don Miguel Ruiz's 4 agreements. Be impeccable with your words. If you're going to do something, do it. If you can't, say the date I had previously worked, I can't do that. Let's work out something else. Number 2, don't take things personal. If somebody says, Reverend Sondrea, that was a terrible program, they have a right to their opinion. They have to learn that. People have a right to their opinion, even if it's something, I think it's the most stupid STOOPID thing I've ever heard. That's their opinion. I don't need to prove them wrong. If somebody says it's 90 degrees outside and I know it's 45, so what? If their life won't be threatened, then let it go. Be impeccable with your word. Don't take things personal. Avoid assumptions. Just because somebody say they saved don't mean they saved. Just because a person got a PhD does not mean they can think or that they understand the material. Just mean they knew how to get through the hoops to do it. And the last is do the best you can. So freedom, appreciation, compassion, communication, trust, and sincerity. So I challenge all those who are listening to start practicing that on a daily basis. And first of all, start off, I'm going to be kind to myself today. So I'm not going to work 15 hours, Brother Michael. I am going to work 8 hours. I'm going to get my sleep. And so, the body is wonderful. You can play all those games in your 30s and 40s, but I tell you, at some point, your body will say, I'm not going to do that. Yes.
Thank you so much. This has been most certainly rich conversation tonight of allowing us to reason together around the 4 tenets of Scarritt Bennett, of spiritual formation, transformative education, women's empowerment, and racial justice through your work, which is quite varied. And thank you so much. So, Doc, if you would say what's next for you and how folks can get in contact with you, and we will close out.
Thank you so much. It has been a thrilling pleasure. I love doing this kind of work and having these kind of conversations. I'm available. I love to travel. We can always do Zoom. Next for me, God has called me to help people help themselves not to hurt, especially through grief management and through writing excellence, several of the things we talked about tonight. And I'm in the process of building the website so that people will be able to download the boot camps and get trained that way. I also will be doing some Facebook Lives events because I want people not to hurt. Life is way too short. When we think about how big the planet is and how long it's been, I mean, if we're lucky, we'll get, 70 years. So I want people to have a blast. So that's the work I'll be doing. I coach writing. I'll be doing writing seminars. You can get the book Breaking Free to Write from Fear to Finish. And then I'm happy to do consulting with groups because my dream is to consult with branches of the military because they have even additional losses like deployment, who's going to come back, are they going to be dismembered, all of that. I want to work with a denominational group because I really want to work with a large group of women because I'm tired of women hurting themselves and hurting each other. Because unfortunately, because we live in a patriarchal, misogynistic world, then a lot of times when women have been mentored by men, we learn some of their bad behaviors. And so then we do this crab syndrome, and I want to help women overcome that and also the grief around that. So I'm available to do that. You can email me at drcherylkd@gmail.com. You can Google me, and the websites will pop up, and pray my strength. I love doing this. I'm happy to work with people over their grief or their writing or coaching because I love being a cheerleader, and I'm pretty good. I've not found people that I couldn't get moved at least a few inches, so be in touch. And again, thank you for this opportunity. And let me say, if you've not participated in any Scarritt Bennett events, I'm telling you, you don't know what you're missing. So please do, on your websites when you can do a star or bookmark Scarritt Bennett and show up because, especially under the new leadership of Reverend Sondrea Tolbert, who's also JD, M.Div, all of that, and a bag of chips and a couple of coats and suits in the closet, come and see your life transformed. And so I'm excited to be here. Please remember this space. Also, if you want to have a wedding or you need to have a retreat, you need to come on over here. They have this gorgeous staircase, which is wonderful for photo ops. So come and enjoy and listen. So who's over the kitchen?
Oh, Chef Jen.
Chef Jen is the bomb. I'm vegan and sister girl. Oh my goodness, she laid it out. I mean, I'd come back just for her food, along with Reverend Sondrea's programming. So really, Nashville and folks in Tennessee, you have an amazing jewel here. And for folk who need to do retreats and you need to get out of your area, come check them out at Scarritt Bennett. The hospitality, I've been here for a week, so I can attest. The hospitality and the accommodations are superb. So please, your next events, thinking about planning ahead and check them out. Again, thank you.
Thank you. You did my spiel for me. That Scarritt Bennett is most certainly a place that has room for you. We have meeting room, we have sleeping room, we have eating room, and most certainly we have a place for you to be engaged.
And the labyrinth, don't forget the labyrinth.
And the labyrinth to walk around and pray. So we invite you most certainly to come for any of our offerings here at Scarritt, for you to gather, for you to engage, for you to be equipped, and for you to be empowered. Come to Scarritt Bennett, where hospitality most certainly is justice. Thank you all so much for joining us, and continue to watch the website and Facebook Live and YouTube for offerings that are coming up next week. We have Poets Corner next Thursday, but before that, I guess I'm in the chapel, huh? I'm in the chapel Tuesday.
Don't forget the art.
Tuesdays in the chapel. We're going to keep her around. We're going to keep her around. We have art. Henry Fiskite, Henry Jones's art is on display in Lasky Gallery now. Come, and we're open from like 9 to 4 for you to view his artwork. It is amazing. It just left the Parthenon, so come on and enjoy that. I would be remiss, Dr. Cummings is here for us not to say that most certainly join the MLK festivities starting on Sunday. Starting Saturday, excuse me. Starting Saturday and throughout the week, the Women of Faith panel will be on Sunday. Go to IMF's page and join in on all the MLK activities throughout the city, throughout the rest of the weekend, virtually. Everything is virtual, so you have no excuse. We will be from making sure that everyone's safe. And so we will be joining in on the Women's Faith panel on Sunday. And join us Tuesdays in the chapel at 12:30 every Tuesday. And yours truly is this Tuesday. So we will be in the place or online. So we thank you most certainly. Thank you, staff. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Donna, for helping us with this first clergy conversation. And those that have joined in person as well as virtual, continue to do justice work, because most certainly justice work is needed. God bless you.